The antiseptic smell still clung to my hospital gown as I sat on that cold metal bench, watching bus after bus pull away without me. Each one carried strangers home to families who cared enough to show up. The October wind cut through the thin fabric, and every breath sent sharp reminders through my chest where they'd made their incisions just hours before. I kept checking my phone, certain there had to be a mistake. Certain my son Michael would come barreling around the corner with some explanation about traffic or work or anything that would make sense of why his 68-year-old mother was sitting alone at a bus stop after major surgery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But he never came. What I didn't know then, as I counted the change in my purse to see if I had enough for the bus fare home, was that this moment would change everything between us. What I couldn't have imagined was that 3 months later, he'd be sitting in that same spot where he'd abandoned me, begging for my help to save his entire future. Some lessons take time to teach, and some children take even longer to learn. This is the story of how I went from being the mother he threw away to becoming the woman who held his destiny in her hands. And trust me, the ending isn't what you'd expect. My name is Rebecca Jenkins, though most folks have called me Becky for more years than I care to count. I raised my son Michael as a single mother after his father decided that responsibility wasn't for him when Michael was barely 3 years old. For 32 years, it was just the two of us against the world. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, saved every penny I could for his college fund, and made sure he never went without anything he needed and most things he wanted. I sacrificed dates, friendships, and dreams of my own to make sure Michael had every opportunity I never did. When he wanted to play baseball, I worked weekends to pay for the equipment. When he needed a car for his senior year, I took out a loan against my already mortgaged house. When he graduated college and couldn't find work immediately, I let him live with me rent-free for 2 years while he got on his feet. Looking back now, I can see how I created the very monster that would later abandon me. But mothers don't think that way when they're in the thick of it. We just love and give and hope that somehow all that devotion will come back to us when we need it most. The morning of my surgery, I called Michael 3 times. The first call went to voicemail. The second call, he answered with that irritated tone he'd developed whenever I needed something from him. "What is it, Mom?" "Just wanted to confirm you're picking me up at 3 o'clock today. Dr. Patterson said the procedure should be finished by then." There was a pause, and I could hear video game sounds in the background. My 35-year-old son was playing video games at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. Yeah, I'll be there. 3 o'clock. At the main entrance, remember? The recovery nurse said. "I got it, Mom. 3 o'clock, main entrance. Can I go now?" The line went dead before I could say I loved him. That should have been my first warning. The surgery itself went well. Better than expected, actually. Dr. Patterson removed the mass from my abdomen and told me the biopsy results would be back in a week, but he was optimistic. The anesthesia left me groggy and nauseous, but the nurse, a sweet young woman named Patricia, helped me get dressed and walked me to the main entrance right at 3 o'clock. "Your son should be here any minute," she said, checking her watch. "Why don't you sit here while we wait?" She positioned me in a wheelchair near the automatic doors where Michael couldn't possibly miss me. The October air was crisp, and I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders. The incision site throbbed with each heartbeat, and the prescription, pain medication they'd given me, hadn't kicked in yet. 3:15 came and went. Patricia checked on me twice, offering to call Michael herself. I gave her his number, but it went straight to voicemail. By 3:30, the shift change was happening, and Patricia was replaced by an older nurse who didn't know about my situation. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you can't sit here indefinitely. Are you waiting for someone?" "My son," I said, the words feeling heavier each time I had to repeat them. "He's just running a little late." But even as I said it, I knew. The same way I'd known when his father started coming home later and later, making excuses that got more creative and less believable. The same way I'd known when Michael started avoiding my calls and visits became obligatory rather than genuine. Deep down, I knew he wasn't coming. By 4 o'clock, I had two choices: call a taxi I couldn't afford, or figure out the bus system I hadn't used in over a decade. The taxi would have cost $47, money I needed for my prescription medications. The bus was $2.50 each way, assuming I could figure out which routes would get me home. I shuffled to the information desk, still moving carefully, because of the surgery, and asked the volunteer for help with the bus schedule. She was probably Michael's age, and the pity in her eyes when she realized what was happening made my cheeks burn with shame. "The number 14 will get you closest to your address," she said gently. "But you'll need to transfer downtown. Are you sure there's no one who can pick you up?" I thought about calling my neighbor Mrs. Chen, but she was 83 and hadn't driven at night in years. I thought about calling my sister in Atlanta, but what could she do from 400 miles away? The truth was, Michael was the only person in my life I'd been able to count on, and now I couldn't even count on him. The walk to the bus stop felt like miles, though it was probably only 2 blocks. Each step sent shooting pains through my abdomen, and I had to stop twice to rest against building walls. Other people passed me, hurrying to their own destinations, their own families, their own lives that didn't include a 68-year-old woman recovering from surgery. The bus stop was just a metal bench and a sign listing route numbers and times. I sat down carefully, protecting my incision, and tried to make sense of the schedule. The next number 14 wasn't due for 23 minutes. The November. Air was getting colder as the sun moved lower in the sky, and I realized I should have asked for a blanket from the hospital. That's when I started calling Michael again. The first call went to voicemail after 1 ring, which meant he'd declined it. The second call did the same. The third call, he answered, and I could hear noise in the background like he was at a restaurant or bar. "Mom, I can't talk right now." "Michael, I'm at the bus stop. You were supposed to pick me up at 3. "What bus stop? What are you talking about?" The casual confusion in his voice hit me harder than any anger would have. He'd completely forgotten. My surgery, my need for a ride home, the conversation we'd had that very morning. None of it had been important enough for him to remember. "The hospital, Michael. My surgery was today. You promised to pick me up." There was a pause, and then I heard him say something to someone else, his hand partially covering the phone. When he came back, his tone had shifted to irritation. "Look, I'm dealing with something important right now. Can't you just take a taxi or something?" "Michael, I just had surgery. I'm sitting at a bus stop and it's getting dark." "Then call an Uber. They're everywhere now." "I don't know how to use Uber, and I don't have that kind of money for a taxi." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear a woman laughing and Michael saying, "Yeah, give me just a second. Mom, I really can't do this right now. Figure it out, okay?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're an adult." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a full minute, reading and rereading his name on the call log, trying to process what had just happened. My son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had just told me to figure it out, after surgery, while I was sitting alone at a bus stop in the growing darkness. The number 14 bus arrived 27 minutes late, its brakes squealing as it pulled to the curb. The driver, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes, took one look at me and frowned. "You okay, sweetheart? You look a little pale." "I'm fine," I lied, struggling to climb the steps with my post-surgery limitations. "Just need to get home." He waited patiently while I fumbled with my change, and when I dropped a quarter, he bent to pick it up for me. His small kindness almost broke me completely. The bus was nearly empty, just a few other passengers scattered across the worn seats. I found a spot near the front and pressed my face against the cool window, watching the city pass by in a blur of streetlights and strangers' lives. Each bump in the road sent fresh pain through my incision, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. The transfer downtown was a nightmare. The bus terminal was crowded with evening commuters, all moving with purpose and urgency that I couldn't match in my condition. It took me 15 minutes to find the right platform for my connecting bus, and by the time I got there, I'd missed it by 3 minutes. The next one wouldn't come for 47 minutes. I found an empty bench and sat down heavily, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. I was alone. Not just at this bus stop, not just tonight, but truly alone in the world. The person I'd devoted my entire adult life to protecting and providing for had abandoned me in my moment of greatest need. The second bus was even later than the first, and by the time I finally made it to my neighborhood, it was nearly 8 o'clock. The walk from the bus stop to my house was only 4 blocks, but in my condition, in the darkness, it might as well have been 40. I used my house key as a walking stick, stopping every few yards to rest against mailboxes and fence posts. Mrs. Chen's house was dark, and I didn't want to worry her anyway. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to move and shift with my medication-clouded vision. When I finally reached my front door, I was exhausted, in pain, and emotionally devastated. But I was also relieved to be home, to be safe, to be able to rest and recover and try to make sense of what had happened. I turned my key in the lock, but it wouldn't turn. I tried again, thinking maybe my hands were shaking too much from the cold and the medication. Still nothing. I checked the key, thinking maybe I'd grabbed the wrong one, but it was definitely my house key, worn smooth from 30 years of use. That's when I noticed the deadbolt above the regular lock. A new deadbolt that hadn't been there when I left for the hospital that morning. I rang the doorbell, thinking maybe Michael was inside and had installed some kind of security feature while I was gone. No answer. I knocked, gently at first, then more insistently. Still nothing. It took my surgery-addled brain several minutes to piece together what was happening. Michael had changed the locks. While I was in surgery, while I was sitting at that bus stop, while I was struggling through 2 bus transfers and a 4-block walk in the dark, my son had been at my house, changing the locks to keep me out. I sat down on my own front porch steps, the concrete cold against my legs, and finally let myself cry. Not the quiet tears I'd been holding back all day, but deep, body-shaking sobs that made my incision ache and my chest burn. I cried for the mother I'd been, sacrificing everything for a child who saw me as disposable. I cried for the woman I was now, homeless and heartbroken on my own doorstep. And I cried for the future I'd imagined, where my son would take care of me the way I'd taken care of him. Mrs. Chen's porch light came on, and I saw her peering through her curtains. A few minutes later, she opened her door and shuffled over in her slippers and robe. "Becky, what are you doing out here? Wasn't your surgery today?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in broken pieces between sobs. Michael was supposed to pick me up. He never came. He changed the locks. I can't get in my own house. Mrs. Chen helped me to my feet, her tiny frame surprisingly strong. "You come stay with me tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." I spent that night on Mrs. Chen's couch, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how my life had changed so completely in the span of one day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's face when he was 5 years old, running to me with scraped knees and complete trust that I would make everything better. I remembered him at 16, sulking because I couldn't afford the expensive sneakers his friends had, but accepting the ones I could buy and eventually admitting they were more comfortable anyway. When had he stopped seeing me as someone who mattered? When had I become such a burden that he'd rather make me homeless than deal with my needs for one afternoon? The next morning, Mrs. Chen made me breakfast and helped me call a locksmith. $347 later, I was back in my own house, but everything felt different. The furniture was the same. The pictures on the walls hadn't changed. But the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place where someone had lived before learning they didn't matter to the person who mattered most to them. I found the spare key to my house sitting on the kitchen counter with a note written in Michael's handwriting. Mom, I needed to make some changes for my own peace of mind. Please respect my boundaries and don't contact me unless it's an emergency. Boundaries. After 32 years of having no boundaries between us, after raising him to believe we were a team, after sacrificing my own boundaries countless times, for his benefit, he was suddenly concerned about boundaries. I called him anyway. The number had been disconnected. Over the following weeks, I tried every way I could think of to reach him. I drove to his apartment, but the landlord said he'd moved out 2 weeks earlier without leaving a forwarding address. I called his job, but they said he'd quit suddenly and wouldn't provide any other information. I even tried reaching out through social media, but he'd blocked me on every platform. My son had erased me from his life as completely as if I'd never existed. The biopsy results came back negative, thank God, but I had no one to share the good news with. Dr. Patterson asked about my support system during recovery, and I lied, telling him my son was very attentive. The truth was too humiliating to admit out loud. I spent my recovery period alone, learning to change my own bandages, preparing simple meals that wouldn't strain my healing incision, and trying to make sense of how 32 years of devotion had led to complete abandonment. The neighbors were kind enough, checking on me occasionally, but they had their own lives and families. Mrs. Chen did what she could, but she was 83 and dealing with her own health issues. For the first time in my adult life, I had to figure out who Rebecca Jenkins was when she wasn't being Michael's mother. It wasn't easy. I'd defined myself by my relationship to him for so long that I barely knew how to exist independently. I'd turned down dates because he needed me. I'd skipped social events because he had school functions. I'd chosen jobs based on their flexibility around his schedule rather than their potential for my own growth. But slowly, very slowly, I began to rebuild. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, not just for exercise, but to actually meet my neighbors. I learned that the Johnsons 3 houses down had been wanting someone to help with their vegetable garden. I discovered that the community center offered senior programs I'd never known about because I'd always been too busy with Michael's needs. I enrolled in a basic computer class and learned how to use the internet for more than just checking email. I joined a book club at the library. I volunteered at the local food bank, helping other people who were struggling to make ends meet. For the first time in decades, I started making friends who knew me as Becky, not as Michael's mother. People who valued my opinions, my sense of humor, my experiences. People who showed up when they said they would and called when they said they'd call. 3 months after Michael abandoned me at that bus stop, I was a different woman. Still hurt, still confused about how our relationship had gone so wrong, but no longer defined by the hole his absence had left in my life. I was learning to be whole on my own terms. I had no idea that Michael's life was falling apart at exactly the same pace mine was coming together. I didn't know that his impulsive decision to cut me out of his life had been driven by more than just selfishness and immaturity. I didn't know about the gambling debts he'd accumulated, the loans he'd taken out in my name when he lived with me, the credit cards he'd opened using information from my tax returns. I didn't know that while I was learning to live without him, he was discovering that the bridges he'd burned were the only ones that could have led him back to solid ground. But I was about to find out. The morning he showed up at my door, I was in my garden planting spring bulbs, something I'd never had time for when all my energy went to managing his crises. The doorbell rang, and I almost didn't answer it. I'd grown protective of my peace, careful about who I let into my newly rebuilt life. But something made me get up, brush the dirt from my hands, and walk to the front door. When I opened it, Michael was standing there looking like he'd aged 5 years in the 3 months since I'd seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unwashed, and his eyes had the desperate look of someone who'd run out of options. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. For just a moment, my heart wanted to open the way it always had for him. The mother in me wanted to pull him inside, feed him, fix whatever was wrong, and pretend the last 3 months had never happened. But I'd learned some things about boundaries, too. "What do you want, Michael?" He looked surprised, like he'd expected me to welcome him with open arms despite everything he'd put me through. Like he'd expected the same unconditional forgiveness I'd always given him before. "I need to talk to you. It's important." "Important to who?" "To both of us. Mom, I'm in trouble. Real trouble." I stood in my doorway, this woman I'd become, who valued herself enough not to be anyone's last resort, and I looked at my son. Really looked at him. I saw the manipulation in his posture, the rehearsed desperation in his expression, the calculated vulnerability in his tone. But I also saw something else. Real fear, real desperation, real consequences catching up with choices he'd made. What kind of trouble? The kind that could ruin my whole life. "Mom, I need your help. You're the only person who can fix this." The irony wasn't lost on me. After abandoning me when I needed him most, he was standing at my door claiming I was the only one who could save him. "Come in," I said finally. "But we're going to have a very different kind of conversation than we've ever had before." He stepped inside, and I could see him looking around, noticing the changes I'd made. New curtains, rearranged furniture, photographs of my new friends and activities where his school pictures used to dominate the mantel. The place looks different. I'm different. We sat in my living room, and for the first time in our relationship, I didn't offer him food or ask about his comfort. I simply waited for him to explain why he thought he deserved my help after what he'd done. What he told me over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about the last few years of our relationship, and what I told him in return changed. Everything he thought he knew about the consequences of abandoning the people who love you most. But that's a story for tomorrow, when I'll tell you exactly how a mother's love can become a mother's reckoning, and how sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who need us to teach them the hardest lessons. Some debts, it turns out, come due in ways you never expect. And some mothers, when pushed too far, discover they're capable of things they never imagined. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Michael shifted uncomfortably on my couch, his hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of his jacket sleeve. The silence stretched between us like a canyon that had opened up over the past 3 months. I could see him struggling to find the right words, the ones that would unlock my sympathy the way they always had before. "Mom, I know I messed up. I know leaving you at the hospital was wrong." I said nothing. I'd learned the power of silence during my recovery, how it could force people to fill the empty space with truth instead of excuses. Things have been really complicated for me lately. I've been dealing with some serious problems, and I guess I just couldn't handle anything else. Still, I waited. The afternoon light filtering through my new curtains cast shadows across his face, and I could see the exhaustion there, the weight of whatever consequences had finally caught up with him. "I lost my job 6 months ago," he said finally, "before your surgery. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd worry, and I thought I could figure it out on my own." 6 months. He'd been lying to me for 6 months, letting me believe everything was fine while I planned my surgery around his fictional work schedule. I started gambling to try to make some quick money. Just small stuff at first, you know. But then I got in deeper, and the people I owe money to, they're not the kind of people who accept payment plans. My stomach turned cold. "How much do you owe?" $37,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. I thought about my own modest savings account, the result of decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Even if I'd wanted to help him, which I wasn't sure I did, I couldn't possibly cover that kind of debt. That's not all, he continued, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. When I couldn't pay them, they started threatening me. They said they'd hurt people I cared about if I didn't come up with the money. So you decided the solution was to cut those people out of your life entirely. He looked up at me sharply, surprised by the edge in my voice. I was trying to protect you. By abandoning me after surgery? By changing my locks? By disappearing? Without a word? I thought if they couldn't find connections between us, they'd leave you alone. I stared at this man who looked like my son but seemed like a stranger. Michael, I raised you better than this. I raised you to face problems, not run from them. I raised you to take care of the people who love you, not throw them away when they become inconvenient. His face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I know, Mom. I know I've screwed everything up, but I'm trying to fix it now. How? I've been working construction under the table, trying to save money, but it's not enough, and it's not fast enough. These people, they're not going to wait much longer. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd been tending. The daffodils I'd planted after he left me were just starting to push through the soil, small green shoots of new life emerging from what had looked like dead ground. What exactly do you want from me, Michael? I need you to co-sign for a loan, a big one, enough to pay off the debt and give me a fresh start. I turned back to face him. You want me to risk my home, my security, my entire future on a loan for someone who abandoned me when I needed him most? You're my mother. Yes, I am. And for 32 years, I put that relationship above everything else in my life. My career, my friendships, my chances at love, my own dreams. I gave you everything I had, and when I needed just one thing from you, you threw me away like garbage. Tears were streaming down his face now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was scared and stupid, and I made the worst decision of my life. You made a series of decisions, Michael. You decided to gamble with money you didn't have. You decided to lie to me about losing your job. You decided to prioritize your own comfort over my recovery. You decided to change my locks and cut off all contact. These weren't accidents or mistakes. They were choices. I sat back down, but this time I chose the chair across from him instead of the couch beside him. The physical distance felt important, a reminder of the emotional distance he'd created between us. Tell me about these people you owe money. To me. Michael's face went pale. They're connected, Mom, organized, the kind of people who don't just break your legs anymore. They destroy your whole life, your credit, your reputation, your ability to get work or housing or anything. Have they threatened you directly? They don't have to. I've seen what they do to other people who can't pay. Last week, they found out where I was staying and left a message for me. Just a photo of you working in your garden. Ice ran through my veins. They've been watching me? I think so. That's another reason I need to handle this fast. As long as I owe them money, you're not safe either. I thought about the past 3 months, the peace I'd found in my new routine, the security I'd felt in my rebuilt life. Had it all been an illusion? Had dangerous people been watching me plant flowers and attend book club meetings? Why didn't you come to me when this first started? When you lost your job? When the gambling got out of control? When you first borrowed money from these people? Michael looked down at his hands. Because I knew you'd try to fix it. I knew you'd give me money you couldn't afford to give, or co-sign loans you shouldn't co-sign, or somehow find a way to sacrifice yourself to save me from my own stupidity. And I didn't want to be that burden to you anymore. His words hung in the air between us. After a lifetime of being the person who fixed his problems, he'd finally recognized the pattern and tried to break it by cutting me out entirely. In his twisted logic, abandoning me had been an act of love. So instead, you decided to break my heart and leave me to recover from surgery alone. I thought it would be temporary. I thought I could handle it myself and then come back and explain everything once it was over. But you couldn't handle it yourself. No, I couldn't. I looked at this man I'd raised, this person I'd loved more than my own life, and tried to reconcile him with the son who'd left me stranded at a bus stop. The Michael sitting in my living room seemed genuinely remorseful, but I'd seen him sorry before. Sorry for wrecking my car in high school. Sorry for dropping out of college the first time. Sorry for the credit card debt he'd racked up in his 20s. Sorry had never seemed to translate into lasting change. Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. He nodded eagerly. In all the years I've been helping you, supporting you, bailing you out of trouble, have you ever once considered how your choices affected me? The question seemed to surprise him. Of course I have. I've always felt guilty about how much you've had to sacrifice for me. Feeling guilty isn't the same as considering the impact. When you were gambling with money you didn't have, did you think about how losing that money might affect the people who would have to help you? When you lied about losing your job, did you think about how that lie would affect my ability to plan for my own needs? When you decided to cut me out of your life, did you think about how that would feel for someone who had never cut you out of hers? Michael was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. No, I didn't think about any of that. I just thought about how to make my immediate problems go away. That's what I thought. I stood up again and walked to the kitchen, needing a moment to process everything he'd told me. The debt, the threats, the danger he'd potentially brought to my doorstep, the months of lies and the calculation behind his abandonment of me. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard where I'd been learning to grow things for myself instead of just nurturing other people's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that the garden I'd started as a symbol of my independence might now be threatened by the very person I'd been trying to become independent from. When I returned to the living room, Michael was still sitting exactly where I'd left him, staring at his hands like they held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. I'm not going to co-sign a loan for you, I said. His head snapped up, and I could see the panic flashing across his face. Mom, please, you don't understand. These people will... I understand perfectly. You've gotten yourself into a situation that requires someone else to risk everything to save you, and you've decided that someone should be me. Just like always. This is different. This is life and death. It's exactly the same, Michael. You've made choices that you can't live with the consequences of, and you want me to absorb those consequences for you. The only difference is the scale. I sat back down and looked at him directly. But I'm going to help you anyway. Hope flickered in his eyes. You are? Not the way you want me to. Not by enabling you to continue making the same mistakes over and over again. But I'm going to help you because despite everything you've done, you're still my son. And I still love you. What do you mean? I'd been thinking about this moment for months, ever since the day he abandoned me. During all those nights lying awake wondering how I'd failed as a mother, I'd been formulating a different approach. A way to help him that might actually help instead of just postponing the next crisis. I'm going to teach you how to fix this yourself. Michael's face fell. Mom, I told you. I don't have that kind of time. These people aren't going to wait for me to slowly earn $37,000 doing construction work. Then we'll have to find another way. Over the next hour, I walked Michael through every option I could think of. Bankruptcy, debt consolidation, legal aid, witness protection if the threats were credible enough, police involvement if the harassment escalated. None of them were easy solutions, and all of them required him to take responsibility for his choices in ways he'd never had to before. There's got to be something else, he kept saying. Some other way that doesn't involve destroying my credit or having a bankruptcy on my record forever. Your credit is already destroyed, Michael. Your record is already damaged. You're not looking for a solution that fixes the problem. You're looking for a solution that lets you pretend the problem never existed. That's not true. Isn't it? You want me to co-sign a loan so you can pay off your gambling debts and start fresh, as if the gambling never happened. You want to erase the consequences without learning from the choices that created them. I could see him struggling with this concept, the idea that some problems can't be solved by throwing money at them or having someone else absorb the damage. What if I promise to pay you back? What if I give you collateral? What collateral could you possibly give me? You don't own anything. You don't have a job. You don't have any assets. I could give you my car. I almost laughed. Michael, your car is worth maybe $3,000 and you still owe money on it. You're offering me collateral that doesn't exist to secure a loan for $37,000 to pay off debts you incurred through gambling. Do you see how none of this makes sense? Then what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to figure it out. The same way I figured out how to get home from the hospital after you abandoned me. The same way I figured out how to get back into my own house after you changed the locks. The same way I figured out how to rebuild my life after you erased me from yours. The comparison seemed to hit him hard. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked truly ashamed instead of just sorry he'd gotten caught. I never thought about it that way. I know you didn't. That's the problem. We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see him processing everything I'd said, trying to reconcile his expectation of unconditional rescue with the reality of a mother who'd learned to set boundaries. So you're really not going to help me? I'm helping you right now. I'm helping you understand that the way you've been living your life isn't sustainable. I'm helping you see that there are consequences to your choices that can't be fixed by having someone else pay for them. But what about the people I owe money to? What about the threats? We'll figure that out together. But we're going to figure it out in a way that teaches you how to handle your own problems instead of passing them off to someone else. Michael slumped back on the couch, and I could see the defeat in his posture. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected to have. This wasn't the mother he'd expected to find when he came back looking for salvation. I don't know how to do that, Mom. I don't know how to fix problems this big by myself. Then it's time you learned. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking Michael through practical steps he could take, contacting a lawyer about his options, researching debt settlement companies, looking into legitimate ways to increase his income, considering a move to a different city if the threats were serious enough. None of it was what he wanted to hear. All of it required him to take action instead of waiting for someone else to solve his problems. But for the first time in our relationship, I was more concerned with what he needed to learn than what he wanted me to do. As evening approached, Michael finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. Can I stay here tonight? I don't really have anywhere else to go. I considered this carefully. The old me would have said yes immediately, would have made up the spare room and started planning how to take care of him while he figured things out. The new me understood that comfort and consequences needed to coexist. You can stay tonight, but tomorrow you need to find your own place to live. And while you're here, we're going to establish some ground rules. What kind of ground rules? The kind that should have existed years ago. You'll contribute to household expenses. You'll do chores without being asked. You'll treat this house and the person who owns it with respect. And you'll spend every day actively working on solving your problems instead of waiting for someone else to solve them for you. Michael nodded, though I could see the reluctance in his agreement. He was used to my help coming without conditions, used to my love being expressed through sacrifice rather than structure. And Michael, yeah? If you ever abandon me again the way you did after my surgery, you'll never be welcome in this house or in my life again. I mean that. The finality in my voice seemed to surprise him. The old Rebecca had made threats she never followed through on, had drawn lines in the sand that she'd always been willing to erase. But the woman sitting across from him now had learned the difference between love and enabling, between helping and hurting. I understand. I hope you do. That night, I lay in bed listening to Michael moving around in the guest room, and I thought about the conversation we'd had. For the first time in his adult life, I'd said no to him. I'd refused to rescue him from consequences he'd created for himself. I'd offered help, but only the kind that required him to participate in his own salvation. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. I thought about the gambling debts, the threats, the danger he might have brought to my doorstep. I thought about the months of lies and the calculated cruelty of his abandonment. But I also thought about the little boy who used to help me fold laundry, who used to save his allowance to buy me flowers on Mother's Day, who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him bedtime stories. Somewhere between that little boy and this desperate man, I'd lost sight of the difference between loving someone and enabling them. I'd confused sacrifice with support, rescue with relationship. I'd taught him that love meant never having to face the full weight of your own choices. But it wasn't too late to teach him something different. Over the next few days, Michael began the slow, difficult work of confronting his problems head-on. He contacted a lawyer about his options for dealing with the debt. He looked into legitimate debt settlement programs. He started applying for jobs that might provide steady income and benefits. None of it was easy, and all of it required him to acknowledge the reality of his situation instead of looking for magical solutions. There were moments when I could see him struggling with the urge to ask me to just fix everything, to make the hard parts go away the way I always had before. But I held firm. I offered guidance, support, and encouragement. I helped him research his options and accompanied him to meetings with lawyers and creditors. But I didn't offer money, loans, or guarantees. I didn't try to absorb his consequences or minimize his choices. For the first time in our relationship, I was helping him learn to be responsible instead of helping him avoid responsibility. It was harder than I'd expected. Every instinct I'd developed over 32 years of motherhood told me to step in, to fix, to rescue. Watching him struggle with problems I could have solved with a signature was agonizing. But I'd learned something important during those months he'd abandoned me. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to save them from themselves. 3 weeks after he'd shown up at my door, Michael came home from a meeting with a debt settlement company with news that would change everything. They can negotiate the debt down to about $15,000, he said. But I have to come up with that money within 90 days, or the deal falls apart. $15,000 was still far more than he could earn in 3 months doing construction work. It was still far more than I had in my savings account. But it was progress, a concrete step toward resolving the crisis he'd created. How do you plan to raise $15,000 in 90 days? I don't know yet, but at least now I have a target to work toward instead of this impossible mountain of debt. I could see something different in his face when he talked about the meeting. Purpose, maybe, or determination. For the first time since he'd come back, he seemed focused on solving the problem rather than escaping from it. There's something else, he said. The debt settlement company wants to see proof that I'm serious about changing my financial habits. They want me to complete a financial management course and provide documentation of steady income. That sounds reasonable. It is reasonable. It's all reasonable. And that's what's been so hard about this whole process. I looked at him curiously. I keep waiting for someone to offer me an easy way out, some loophole or shortcut that will make this all go away without me having to do the hard work. But every legitimate option requires me to actually change, to actually learn from this mess I've created. How does that feel? Michael was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Scary, but also kind of liberating. Like, maybe if I do this the right way, I won't end up in this situation again. It was the first time I'd heard him talk about preventing future problems instead of just solving current ones. The first time he'd seemed to understand that the goal wasn't just to pay off the debt, but to become the kind of person who doesn't create that kind of debt in the first place. "I'm proud of you," I said. And I meant it. For what? I haven't solved anything yet. For trying to solve it instead of waiting for someone else to solve it for you. That night, Michael asked if he could stay a few more weeks while he worked on raising the settlement money. I agreed, but with the same conditions as before. He would contribute to household expenses, help with chores, and spend every day actively, working toward his goals. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been doing some research of my own during the weeks he'd been staying with me. Research into his financial history, his credit report, his employment record. Research that had revealed some very interesting information about the choices he'd been making long before he'd abandoned me at that bus stop. Information that was about to change everything I thought I knew about my son, and everything he thought. He knew about the consequences of his actions, but that discovery would have to wait. For now, I was content to watch him learn the lesson I should have taught him years ago. That love doesn't mean shielding people from the results of their choices, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to rescue them from themselves. Some lessons, I was beginning to understand, are worth the pain they cost to teach. The manila folder sat on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon, thick with documents I'd spent weeks gathering. Michael was at another job, interview, his third this week, and I'd been using his absences to dig deeper into the financial maze he'd created. What I'd discovered made my stomach turn and my hands shake with an emotion I couldn't quite name yet. It started innocently enough. When Michael first told me about his gambling debts, I'd wanted to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. I'd helped him request his credit report, thinking it would give us a clear picture of his obligations. What came back was far worse than $37,000 in gambling debts. The credit report showed a pattern of financial irresponsibility stretching back almost 8 years. Maxed out credit cards, defaulted loans, accounts in collections. But it was the addresses associated with some of these accounts that first caught my attention. Several of them listed my house as his residence during periods when he'd been living in his own apartment. That's when I decided to pull my own credit report. The first fraudulent account appeared in 2019, a credit card in my name that I'd never applied for, with a billing address I'd never lived at. The spending pattern showed cash advances and purchases that coincided perfectly with Michael's college graduation party, the one I'd thought he'd paid for with money from his new job. By the time I'd finished documenting everything, I'd found 11 fraudulent accounts opened in my name over the past 6 years. Credit cards, personal loans, even a car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen. The total amount of debt Michael had accumulated using my identity was staggering. $43,000. More than his gambling debts. More than I'd saved in my entire lifetime. The dates told a story that made me physically ill. The first fraudulent account was opened 2 months after he'd moved back in with me following his college graduation. He'd had access to my mail, my personal documents, my social security number. He'd used that access to systematically steal my identity while I was cooking his meals and doing his laundry. The pattern continued even after he'd moved out. He'd been intercepting credit card offers addressed to me, using information he'd memorized during the 2 years he lived under my roof. Some of the accounts had been opened from addresses across the state, suggesting he'd been planning this fraud carefully, methodically. The most recent fraudulent account had been opened just 2 weeks before my surgery. While I was preparing for a procedure that terrified me, while I was counting on him to be there for my recovery, he was using my identity to secure yet another loan he had no intention of paying back. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the evidence of my son's betrayal, and I understood something that changed everything about our relationship. Michael hadn't abandoned me at that bus stop because he was scared or overwhelmed or trying to protect me from dangerous people. He'd abandoned me because he knew I was about to discover what he'd been doing to me for years. The fraudulent accounts were starting to go into collections. The credit monitoring alerts were piling up in my mailbox. My credit score, built carefully over decades of responsible financial management, was collapsing under the weight of debts I'd never incurred. It was only a matter of time before I would have noticed the unauthorized accounts, the mysterious bills, the calls from debt collectors. So he'd run. He'd changed my locks not to protect me from his gambling creditors, but to prevent me from confronting him about the identity theft. He'd disappeared not to keep me safe, but to buy himself. Time before his crimes caught up with him. The sound of his key in the front door made me close the folder quickly. I needed time to process what I'd learned, to decide how to handle this new revelation. Michael walked into the kitchen looking more optimistic than I'd seen him since he'd returned. "The interview went really well," he said, opening the refrigerator and pulling out a bottle of water. "It's a supervisor position at a construction company. Better pay, benefits, the whole thing. They said they'd let me know by Friday." I watched him move around my kitchen with easy familiarity, the same way he'd moved through my life for 35 years. Taking what he needed, assuming it would always be available, never questioning whether he had the right to help himself to everything I owned. "That's good news," I managed. "If I get it, I'll be able to save money faster toward the settlement. Maybe even look into getting my own place again." He sat down across from me at the table, and I had to resist the urge to pull the manila folder closer to my chest. The evidence of his betrayal was right there between us, but he had no idea. I'd discovered it. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about learning to solve my own problems instead of waiting for someone else to fix them. What about it?" "I think you're right. I think I've been using you as a safety net my whole life, and it's made me weak. It's made me think I could make any choices I wanted because you'd always be there to catch me when I fell." The irony of his words was almost unbearable. Here he was, talking about using me as a safety net, while sitting on evidence that he'd been systematically destroying my financial security for years. "I want to be different," he continued. "I want to be the kind of person who can handle his own life, who doesn't need his mother to rescue him from every mistake." "What would that look like?" Michael leaned forward, and I could see genuine earnestness in his expression. "It would look like taking responsibility for my choices, all of them, not just the ones that are convenient to admit to." My heart began to race. Was he about to confess? Had he finally decided to tell me about the identity theft, the years of fraud, the systematic destruction of my credit? "Like the gambling," he said. "I need to admit that it wasn't just bad luck or a temporary problem. It was an addiction that I chose to feed instead of treating." And the job situation. I need to admit that I didn't just lose my job 6 months ago. I've been underemployed and unstable for years because I keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I waited, hoping he'd continue, hoping he'd finally tell me the whole truth. "And the way I treated you," he said quietly. "I need to admit that abandoning you wasn't about protecting you from anything. It was about protecting myself from having to face how much I'd disappointed you." Still nothing about the identity theft. Nothing about the fraudulent accounts. Nothing about the $43,000 in debt he'd accumulated in my name. "Is there anything else you need to admit to?" Michael looked at me carefully, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But then he shook his head. "I think that covers the big stuff. Why?" I realized in that moment that he was never going to tell me voluntarily. Even sitting here talking about taking responsibility and being honest, he was still lying to me. Still protecting himself from consequences. Still assuming I would never discover what he'd done. Just wondering if there was anything else we needed to address. "No, I think we're good. Mom, I really am grateful that you're giving me this chance to prove I can change. I know I don't deserve it after what I put you through." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was sitting at my table, eating my food, sleeping in my house, talking about how grateful he was for my help, while hiding the fact that he'd been stealing from me for years. While my credit score plummeted and my financial future crumbled under the weight of his crimes. "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If you discovered that someone you trusted had been lying to you about something important, something that affected your life in a significant way, what would you do?" He considered the question seriously. "I guess it would depend on what they were lying about and why. What if they were lying about something that could seriously damage your future? Something that showed they'd been betraying your trust for years?" That would be different. That would be unforgivable. Even if they were someone you loved? Why, especially if they were someone I loved? Love is supposed to mean honesty, right? If someone really loves you, they don't lie to you about things that could hurt you. I nodded slowly, filing away his words for the conversation we were going to have very soon. That night, I called my sister Patricia in Atlanta. We'd grown closer during the months since Michael abandoned me, and she'd become my sounding board for difficult decisions. "He's been stealing your identity for years?" Her voice rose with indignation. "Becky, you have to call the police. This isn't just family drama. This is serious fraud." "I know what it is." "Do you?" "Because you're talking about it like it's another one of his mistakes instead of a deliberate pattern of criminal behavior. He didn't accidentally open credit cards in your name. He planned this. He executed it systematically. He's been destroying your financial life while letting you worry about his problems." Patricia's anger was validating, but it also scared me. Once I reported this to the authorities, there would be no going back. Michael would face criminal charges. He'd go to prison. Our relationship, already fractured, would be completely destroyed. What if I confronted him first, gave him a chance to come clean and make it right? "Becky, he's had years to come clean. He's had every opportunity to tell you the truth, especially after he came back asking for your help. The fact that he's still lying to you while talking about taking responsibility shows you exactly who he is. He's still my son. And you're still his victim. Don't let your love for him blind you to what he's actually done to you." After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the life I'd rebuilt after Michael's abandonment. The books from my book club stacked on the side table. The photographs from my volunteering activities on the mantle. The peace I'd found in learning to live for myself instead of constantly managing his crises. All of it was built on a foundation that was crumbling because of debts I'd never incurred, credit I'd never used, choices I'd never made. Michael's fraud wasn't just stealing money from me. It was stealing my future, my security, my ability to maintain the independence I'd worked so hard to achieve. The next morning, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the old Rebecca, the one who existed solely to serve her son's needs. I called the credit reporting agencies and placed fraud alerts on my accounts. I contacted the police and filed a report. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected and prepared to press charges. But first, I was going to give Michael one last chance to tell me the truth. When he came home that evening, excited about a callback for the supervisor position, I was waiting in the living room with the manila folder open on the coffee table. "We need to talk," I said. Something in my tone made him freeze in the doorway. His eyes went immediately to the papers spread across the table, and I saw the exact moment when he realized what I'd discovered. His face went white, and his shoulders sagged like a man who'd been carrying a heavy load and finally had to set it down. "Mom, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. You've always been good with explanations." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, and for the first time since he'd returned, he looked truly defeated. Not sorry he'd been caught, not worried about consequences, but genuinely broken by the weight of what he'd done. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I've spent 3 weeks watching you lie to me while talking about taking responsibility and being honest. 3 weeks watching you accept my help while hiding the fact that you've been destroying my financial future for years. Michael put his head in his hands. I wanted to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. When? When exactly were you planning to mention that you've stolen my identity 11 times? When were you going to explain that you've accumulated $43,000 in debt using my name? When were you going to tell me that my credit score has been destroyed by your choices? I was going to fix it first. I was going to get the job and start making payments and repair the damage before you ever had to know about it. I stared at him in amazement. You were going to fix $43,000 in fraudulent debt with a construction job? You were going to repair years of identity theft by making minimum payments? Michael, do you have any idea how long it would take to undo the damage you've done to my credit? I was going to try. You were going to hide it, just like you've been hiding it for years. Just like you hid losing your job. Just like you hid the gambling. Just like you've hidden every major problem in your life until it became too big to manage. Michael looked up at me with tears in his eyes. What are you going to do? I've already done it. I've filed police reports. I've contacted the credit agencies. I've documented everything you've stolen from me over the past 6 years. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Michael processing the implications, understanding that this wasn't another crisis he could talk his way out of or wait for me to solve. You're pressing charges? Yes. Mom, please. I know what I did was wrong, but if you press charges, I'll go to prison. My life will be completely ruined. Your life? What about my life? What about the years I'll spend trying to repair the damage you've done to my credit? What about the retirement I've been planning that's now in jeopardy because of your fraud? What about the trust you've violated, the relationship you've destroyed? I can pay it back. If I get this job, I can set up payment plans for all of it. Michael, even if you got a job paying $50,000 a year, which you won't, it would take you decades to pay back what you've stolen, and that's assuming you never accumulate another penny of debt. And that's just the money. What about the years of lies? What about using my love for you as a weapon against me? He was crying openly now, and I felt something I'd never experienced in 35 years of motherhood. I felt completely unmoved by his tears. They felt manipulative, calculated, designed to make me forget what he'd done and focus on his pain instead. I was desperate. I was making stupid choices, and I didn't know how to stop. I thought if I could just get ahead of the debt, I could fix everything and you'd never have to know. You thought you could commit fraud against your own mother and somehow make it disappear before she noticed. You thought you could destroy her financial security and then repair it secretly. Do you understand how narcissistic that sounds? I'm not a narcissist. I'm just someone who made terrible mistakes. Mistakes are things that happen accidentally. What you did to me was deliberate. You planned it. You executed it. You covered it up. You continued doing it even after you saw the damage it was causing. These weren't mistakes, Michael. These were crimes. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd planted after he abandoned me. The daffodils were in full bloom now, bright yellow proof that life could flourish even after devastation. Do you remember what you told me yesterday about love meaning honesty? I asked without turning around. Yes. You said that if someone really loves you, they don't lie to you about things that could hurt you. You said that kind of betrayal would be unforgivable, especially from someone you loved. I turned back to face him. You've been lying to me about something that hasn't just hurt me. It's destroyed my financial future. You've been committing crimes against me while living in my house, eating my food, accepting my help. And you're still lying to me now by calling it a mistake instead of acknowledging what it really is. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me the truth. All of it. When did you first use my information to open a fraudulent account? How did you get access to my personal documents? How many times have you done this that I haven't discovered yet? For the next 2 hours, Michael confessed to crimes that went far beyond what I'd already uncovered. He'd been stealing my mail for years, intercepting pre-approved credit card offers and loan applications. He'd memorized my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my date of birth. He'd used that information to open accounts, secure loans, even establish utility services in apartments I'd never lived in. The first time he'd used my identity was during his senior year of college, when he'd maxed out his own credit cards and needed money for graduation expenses. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he'd pay it back before I ever knew about it. But the debt had grown faster than his ability to repay it, and instead of confessing, he'd opened another account. By the time he graduated and moved back in with me, identity theft had become his primary method of managing financial problems. Living in my house had made it easier to intercept mail and access documents. He'd been careful to have bills sent to addresses I wouldn't see, to make payments just often enough to avoid immediate collections, to spread the fraud across different credit card companies and banks. When he'd finally moved out 2 years later, he'd taken copies of my personal documents with him. He'd continued opening accounts in my name, using the information he'd stolen and the knowledge of my financial habits he'd gained during years of living with me. The most sickening part was how calculated it all was. He hadn't been stealing from me in moments of desperation. He'd been systematically mining my identity for financial resources while planning his own independent life. He'd used my credit to furnish his apartments, finance his cars, pay for vacations and entertainment. "The gambling debts," I said when he'd finished his confession, "are those even real?" Michael looked down at his hands. "Some of them are, but not $37,000 worth. More like $12,000. So you lied about that too? I inflated the amount because I knew you'd be more likely to help me if you thought I was in physical danger. I thought if I could get you to co-sign for a big enough loan, I could pay off all the gambling debt and most of the fraudulent accounts, and you'd never have to know about any of it." I felt something break inside me that I didn't think could be repaired. "You came to me, after abandoning me, after months of no contact, and you planned to manipulate me into co-signing for a loan to cover up crimes you'd committed against me. I was trying to fix it. You were trying to use me to cover up the fact that you'd been using me? Michael, do you understand that everything about your return has been a lie? The remorse, the promises to change, the gratitude for my help, all of it was just part of a plan to commit more fraud. That's not true. I am grateful, and I do want to change. You want to change your circumstances. You don't want to change your behavior. If you wanted to change your behavior, you would have told me the truth the day you walked back into my life." I sat back down and looked at this stranger who shared my son's face. For 35 years, I'd been loving a fiction, a version of Michael that existed only in my imagination. The real Michael was someone who could look me in the eye while systematically destroying my life. Someone who could accept my help while planning to defraud me further. Someone who could talk about honesty and responsibility while committing crimes against the person who loved him most. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you pack your things and leave my house. The police will contact you about the charges. You'll need to find a lawyer." "Mom, please. I know what I did was wrong, but I'm still your son. We can work through this together." "No, we can't. You stopped being my son the first time you stole my identity. You became my criminal. And I won't be manipulated by a criminal, even one I used to love." The words felt like knives coming out of my mouth, but they were true. The relationship I'd cherished, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, had never actually existed. I'd been loving a lie while the truth was systematically destroying my life. Michael tried several more times to convince me to change my mind, to give him another chance, to find some way to work through this without involving the legal system. but I'd learned something important during the months he'd abandoned me. I didn't exist solely to solve his problems or absorb his consequences. "You have until tomorrow morning to get your things and leave," I told him. "After that, if you're still here, I'll call the police and have you removed." That night, I lay in bed listening to him pack, and I grieved for the relationship I'd thought we had. I grieved for the mother I'd been, who'd loved so completely and blindly that she'd enabled the destruction of her own life. And I grieved for the future I'd planned, the retirement I'd saved for, the security I'd built through decades of careful financial management. But I also felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Relief that the lies were finally over. Relief that I no longer had to wonder why my son had abandoned me, why our relationship had felt so one-sided, why my love and sacrifice never seemed to be enough. The truth was ugly and painful, but it was also liberating. In the morning, Michael left without saying goodbye. I found a note on the kitchen table apologizing again and promising to find a way to make things right. Even in his final communication, he was still lying. There was no way to make this right. Some betrayals are too fundamental, too complete, to be repaired. Over the following weeks, I worked with lawyers and credit agencies to begin the long process of repairing the damage Michael had done. It would take years to fully restore my credit, and some of the financial losses would never be recovered. But for the first time in my adult life, I was living in reality instead of the fantasy of a relationship that had never actually existed. I also discovered something that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. While documenting the extent of Michael's fraud, I'd learned quite a bit about how identity theft works, how credit reporting functions, and how financial institutions verify information. Knowledge that would soon prove very useful when Michael's desperation drove him to make an even bigger mistake than he'd ever made before. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. Michael hired a lawyer who advised him to plead not guilty and fight the charges. He was released on bail and apparently found somewhere to live, though I had no idea where. I didn't want to. No. What I did know was that his strategy of denying responsibility wasn't going to work any better in court than it had worked in our relationship. I had documentation of every fraudulent account, every forged application, every lie he'd told to steal my identity. The evidence was overwhelming, and his guilt was undeniable. But Michael had always been someone who believed he could talk his way out of consequences, and apparently that confidence extended to criminal charges. His lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to delay the trial, trying to get evidence excluded, trying to find some technicality that would save his client from the full weight of what he'd done. During one of these hearings, I learned something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. Michael's lawyer argued that the identity theft had been motivated by mental illness, specifically a gambling addiction that had impaired his judgment and decision-making ability. It was a clever legal strategy, but it was also revealing. Michael was still trying to avoid responsibility by claiming his choices weren't really his choices, still trying to be the victim of circumstances instead of the perpetrator of crimes. But what really caught my attention was a detail mentioned almost in passing during the hearing. Michael's lawyer referenced other debts, other creditors, other financial obligations that went beyond what I'd discovered. The identity theft hadn't been limited to stealing from me. He'd been defrauding other people too. That's when I realized that Michael's financial situation was far more desperate than he'd ever let on. The fraud against me wasn't his only crime. I was just one victim among many, and the total scope of his criminal behavior was larger than I'd imagined. It also meant that his need for money was more urgent than I'd understood. Desperate people make desperate choices, and Michael was about to make a choice that would give me an opportunity I'd never expected, the chance to teach him a lesson about consequences that he would never forget. The opportunity came 3 months after he'd left my house, in the form of a phone call that would change everything between us one final time. The phone rang at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. The caller ID showed Michael's number, which surprised me since his lawyer had advised him not to contact me directly while the criminal case was pending. I almost didn't answer, but something about the late hour and the persistent ringing made me pick up. "Mom?" His voice was barely recognizable, shaky and desperate in a way that made my chest tighten despite everything he'd done to me. "Michael, you shouldn't be calling me." I know. But I didn't know who else to call. "Mom, I'm in serious trouble." I sat up in bed, immediately alert. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that could get me killed. The people I borrowed money from, they've found out about the criminal charges. They think I'm going to flip on them, to get a better deal with the prosecutor." "Are you?" "There's nothing to flip about. These aren't the kind of people who keep records or leave paper trails. But they don't believe me. They think I know something that could hurt them." I could hear traffic in the background and what sounded like wind. He was calling from outside somewhere, probably trying to stay mobile to avoid being found. "Where are you?" "I can't tell you that. It's not safe." "Mom, I need help. I need money to disappear for a while, maybe leave the state until this blows over." The audacity of it stunned me into silence. After everything he'd done, after stealing my identity for years, after destroying my credit and my trust, he was calling me in the middle of the night asking for money to help him run from the consequences of his actions. How much money? 10,000, maybe 15, enough to get somewhere far away and stay hidden for a few months. "Michael, I don't have that kind of money. And even if I did, why would I give it to you?" "Because I'm your son, and if these people find me, they're going to kill me." The desperation in his voice sounded genuine, but I'd learned not to trust my instincts when it came to Michael's crises. He'd been manipulating my emotions for so long that I couldn't tell the difference between real danger and manufactured drama anymore. "If you're really in danger, you should go to the police." "The police can't protect me from these people. And if I go to them now, it'll look like I'm trying to cooperate to get out of the identity theft charges. My lawyer says that could backfire completely." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you borrowed money from dangerous people." "Mom, please, I know you hate me right now, and I deserve that, but I'm begging you, help me one more time." I looked around my bedroom at the peace I'd built in the month since I'd discovered his betrayal. The books on my nightstand from the library volunteer program I'd joined, the pictures of new friends I'd made in my senior hiking group, the life I'd created that didn't revolve around managing his disasters. "I can't help you, Michael. Can't or won't. Both. I can't because you've destroyed my credit and depleted my savings with your fraud. And I won't because helping you run from consequences isn't help at all. It's enabling." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing heavily. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from desperation to something harder, more calculating. "What if I told you I had a way to fix everything? All the damage I've done to your credit, all the money I've stolen. What if I could make it all disappear?" "I'd say you're lying, just like you've been lying to me for years." "I'm not lying this time. I know how to repair credit scores, how to remove negative marks, how to make it look like none of the fraud ever happened. I learned from the best criminals in the business, Mom. I could fix your credit better than it was before I messed it up." "In exchange for what?" "For helping me disappear. Give me the money I need to get away from these people, and I'll spend however long it takes fixing your credit from wherever I end up." I almost laughed at the transparency of his manipulation. Even facing death threats, he was trying to con me into giving him money by promising to undo crimes he'd already committed against me. "Michael, even if you could do what you're claiming, which I doubt, why would I trust you? You've lied to me about everything else." "Because this time it's in my interest to keep my word. If I take your money and don't fix your credit, you'll just add that to the criminal charges against me. But if I actually repair the damage I've done, Maybe you'll consider dropping the charges." "I'm not dropping the charges. You might change your mind if I could give you back everything I took from you. Your credit score, your financial security, your peace of mind." I found myself considering his offer, despite every rational thought, in my head telling me it was another scam. The damage to my credit was real and extensive. Repairing it through legitimate channels would take years and cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. If Michael really could fix what he'd broken, it might be worth the risk. But then I remembered something my sister Patricia had told me months earlier. Don't let your love for him blind you to what he's actually done to you. The answer is no, Michael. Mom, please think about this. These people are serious. If they find me, I'm dead. And if I'm dead, you'll never get back what I stole from you. If you're dead, at least I'll know you can't steal anything else from me. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. Living with the constant fear that Michael would find new ways to betray me was exhausting. Death would at least provide certainty. I can't believe you just said that to me. I can't believe you called me at midnight asking for money after committing identity theft against me for 6 years. We're both full of surprises. Michael was quiet for so long that I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had taken on a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, calculating, almost threatening. You know, Mom, you're not the only one who's learned things during this whole situation. You're not the only one who's done research. What's that supposed to mean? It means I know about your finances better than you think I do. I know about accounts you don't even remember having. I know about credit cards you applied for years ago and forgot about. I know about mistakes you've made that could be very embarrassing if they came to light. My blood went cold. What are you talking about? I'm talking about having access to your personal information for years. I'm talking about knowing things about your financial history that you might not want people to know. Things that might affect how people see you, how they judge the choices you've made. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining the situation. You have information that could hurt me, and I have information that could hurt you. Maybe we should think about how to help each other instead of how to destroy each other. The transformation was complete. The desperate, frightened son who'd called begging for help had revealed himself to be someone capable of blackmail and extortion. Someone who would threaten his own mother to get what he wanted. What information do you think you have about me? Let's just say that your credit report isn't the only document I've been looking at over the years, and some of the financial decisions you made when I was younger might look very different to a prosecutor who's already convinced you're a victim. I tried to think what he could be referring to. My financial history was boring and responsible. I'd never made any questionable decisions, never engaged in anything that could be construed as fraudulent or illegal. Unless he was talking about the joint account. When Michael was 23 and struggling to establish credit, I'd added him as an authorized user to one of my credit cards. It was supposed to help him build a credit history while giving him access to emergency funds. But he'd used the card far more liberally than we'd agreed, and when I'd tried to remove him from the account, he'd convinced me to let him stay on by promising to be more responsible. For years, he'd been making purchases with that card and then paying me back in cash. I'd been depositing his cash payments into my checking account without really thinking about the paper trail it created. To an outside observer, it might look like I was knowingly participating in some kind of financial scheme. The credit card, I said. The credit card. The one where you've been accepting cash payments for purchases you didn't make. The one where you've been helping me move money around without proper documentation. The one that could make you look like a willing participant in financial fraud instead of an innocent victim. My heart sank as I realized what he was suggesting. The cash payments, the lack of proper documentation, the years of loosely structured financial arrangements between us could be twisted to make it look like I'd been complicit in his fraudulent activities. That's not what happened, and you know it. I know it, and you know it. But would a jury know it? Would a prosecutor believe that you were just naive and trusting? Or would they think you were a sophisticated criminal who got caught and decided to blame everything on your son? You bastard. I learned from the best, Mom. You taught me that family is supposed to take care of each other, that love means sacrifice, that we're supposed to protect the people who matter to us. Well, I matter to you, and I need protection. I realized in that moment that I was talking to a complete stranger. The son I'd raised, the person I'd loved and sacrificed for, was gone. In his place was someone who would destroy me to save himself, someone who would use my love against me as a weapon. How much do you want? 15,000, cash, tomorrow. I don't have $15,000 in cash. Then you better figure out how to get it. Because if I'm arrested or killed before I can disappear, some very interesting documents are going to find their way to the prosecutor's office. Documents that will make you look like the mastermind behind all of this instead of the victim. Michael, I'm your mother. And I'm your son. But apparently that doesn't mean what I thought it meant. The line went dead. I sat in my bed staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. My son had gone from begging for help to threatening to frame me for his crimes in the space of a 15-minute conversation. The manipulation was so complete, so calculated, that I wondered if anything he'd ever said to me had been genuine. But even as I reeled from his betrayal, a part of my mind was working on a different problem. Michael thought he was the only one who'd learned new skills during our months apart. He thought he was the only one who'd been doing research, gathering information, planning for contingencies. He was wrong. During the weeks I'd spent documenting his identity theft, I'd learned quite a bit about financial fraud and credit manipulation. I'd learned how accounts were opened, how information was verified, how credit reporting agencies functioned. I'd learned about the systems Michael had been exploiting to steal from me. But I'd also learned something else. I'd learned how to exploit those same systems myself. The next morning, I called in sick to my volunteer position at the library and spent the day making phone calls and gathering information. I started with the credit card company that held the joint account Michael had referenced in his threat. I need to report some suspicious activity on my account, I told the customer service representative. I think someone may have been using my card without my permission. The process was surprisingly straightforward. The credit card company was eager to help a victim of fraud, especially an elderly woman who seemed confused and distressed by the unauthorized activity on her account. They immediately froze the card and initiated a fraud investigation. Within hours, I had documentation showing that the card had been used for purchases I claimed to have no knowledge of. The cash deposits into my checking account could be explained as payments from my son for various expenses I'd covered for him over the years. The lack of proper documentation was just the result of trusting family arrangements. By the end of the day, I had transformed Michael's blackmail material into evidence that supported my status as a victim rather than a participant. The joint account that he thought would implicate me in his crimes now looked like another example of his fraudulent activity. But I wasn't finished. That evening, I called Michael back. "I have your money," I said when he answered. That was fast. "I'm motivated to protect myself." "Smart. Where do you want to meet?" "I don't. I'm not giving you cash." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not handing you $15,000 in untraceable bills so you can disappear and leave me holding the bag for your crimes. If you want help, it's going to be on my terms." "Mom, I told you what would happen if you didn't cooperate. And I told you I'd get you the money. I just didn't say how I'd give it to you." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a wire transfer to an account of your choosing. Electronic, traceable, documented. The kind of transaction that creates records showing exactly when and why the money was sent. That's not what we agreed to. We didn't agree to anything. You made demands, and I'm responding to them. take it or leave it. Michael was quiet. For a long time, I could practically hear him weighing his options, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. "The transfer has to happen tonight," he said finally. "I can't wait any longer." "Fine, give me the account information." "And the documents I mentioned?" "Will stay exactly where they are unless something happens to me. Consider them insurance." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie Michael would believe because it was the kind of manipulative thinking he would use himself. "Okay. But Mom, if you're setting me up somehow, if this is some kind of trick, you'll regret it." "The only thing I regret is raising a son who would threaten his own mother." I took down the account information Michael provided and promised to initiate the wire transfer within the hour. But I had no intention of sending him money. Instead, I was about to give him something much more valuable, a lesson in consequences that he would never forget. The account number Michael had given me belonged to a bank in Nevada, which made sense if he was planning to disappear somewhere in the western states. But what he didn't know was that I'd been expecting this call, planning for this moment, preparing for the opportunity to turn his desperation against him. During the months since I'd discovered his identity theft, I'd been learning about more than just credit repair and fraud documentation. I'd been learning about Michael himself, about his patterns and habits, about the ways he thought and operated. I knew, for instance, that he had a tendency to use the same passwords for multiple accounts. I knew that he often used variations of his own name and birth date for security questions. I knew that he was careless about protecting his personal information when he was under stress. Most importantly, I knew that he'd been using my identity for so long that he'd started thinking of my financial resources as his own, which meant he'd been monitoring my accounts, tracking my financial activity, keeping tabs on money he considered available for his use. What he didn't know was that I'd been monitoring his monitoring. The computer skills I'd learned during my recovery had extended far beyond basic internet use and email. I'd learned about digital security, about protecting personal information, about detecting unauthorized access to accounts. And I'd learned that Michael had been regularly checking my bank balances, my credit card statements, my financial activity. But I'd also learned something else. The software Michael was using to monitor my accounts left traces, digital footprints that could be followed back to his own devices and accounts. For months, I'd been gathering information about his online activity, his digital habits, his electronic vulnerabilities. Tonight, I was going to use that information to teach him that some students eventually become better than their teachers. Instead of sending Michael $15,000, I was going to send him something much more valuable. The realization that he wasn't the only one in our family capable of learning new tricks. The account number he'd given me wasn't just a destination for a wire transfer. It was a gateway into his financial life, his digital identity, his carefully constructed plans for escape and survival. And I was about to walk through that gateway with skills he'd never imagined his 68-year-old mother could possess. By morning, Michael would understand that the woman he'd been manipulating and threatening wasn't the same person who'd raised him. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who'd learned to fight back using the very weapons he'd tried to use against her. Some lessons I discovered are best taught by example, and the example I was about to set would change everything between us forever. The glow from my computer screen illuminated my kitchen as I worked through the night, fingers moving across the keyboard with a precision that would have surprised anyone who knew me as just a retired textile worker. The digital skills I'd acquired during my transformation weren't limited to basic internet browsing and email management. I'd gone much deeper, driven by a need to understand exactly how Michael had been manipulating my financial life for so many years. What started as an attempt to document his identity theft had evolved into something much more sophisticated. I'd learned about network security, digital forensics, financial system vulnerabilities. I'd discovered online communities where victims of financial fraud shared information about tracking and recovering stolen assets. I'd even found forums where reformed criminals discussed the methods they'd once used to exploit financial institutions. The account number Michael had provided led me down a digital trail that revealed far more than he'd ever intended to share. Within an hour of our phone conversation, I'd traced the Nevada bank account to a network of financial institutions he'd been using to launder money and hide assets. The sophisticated system he'd constructed to manage his fraudulent activities was impressive in its complexity and terrifying in its scope. But it also contained a fatal flaw that Michael had never considered. It was all built on the foundation of my stolen identity. Every account, every transaction, every carefully constructed financial alias could be traced back to information he'd taken from me. And as the legitimate owner of that identity, I had legal standing to reclaim everything he'd built with it. The wire transfer I'd promised him never materialized. Instead, I spent the night systematically dismantling his entire financial network. Using identity recovery procedures I'd learned from fraud prevention specialists, I began reclaiming control of every account that had been opened with my personal information. The process was methodical, time-consuming, and absolutely devastating. To Michael's carefully constructed escape plan. By 3 a.m, I'd frozen 17 bank accounts across 4 states. By 4, I'd initiated fraud alerts that would prevent any new accounts from being opened using my information. By 5, I'd contacted law enforcement agencies in 3 states to report the additional criminal activity I'd uncovered. The Nevada account Michael had intended to use for his disappearance was now inaccessible, along with every other financial resource he'd accumulated through years of identity theft. The money he'd stolen, the credit he'd fraudulently obtained, the complex web of false identities he'd created, all of it was gone, reclaimed or frozen by the legitimate victim of his crimes. But I wasn't finished. The digital forensics skills I'd developed had revealed something even more significant than Michael's financial crimes. Hidden in the metadata of his electronic communications, buried in the transaction histories of his fraudulent accounts, was evidence of a criminal network that extended far beyond my son's individual activities. Michael hadn't been working alone. The sophisticated methods he'd used to steal and manipulate financial information were too advanced for someone with his limited technical knowledge. He'd been part of an organized identity theft ring, providing access to victim information in exchange for a percentage of the profits from fraudulent activities. The dangerous people he claimed to owe money to weren't just loan sharks or gambling creditors. They were criminal partners who'd been using him to access and exploit the personal information of multiple victims. And when he'd been arrested for identity theft, they'd seen him as a potential liability who might expose their entire operation to law enforcement. The threat to his life was real, but not for the reasons he'd claimed. He wasn't just a debtor trying to escape his obligations. He was a criminal informant who possessed information that could destroy a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. This revelation changed everything about my approach to the situation. Michael wasn't just my son who'd betrayed me. He was a criminal, whose activities had endangered other innocent victims, people who'd suffered the same financial devastation I'd experienced. His fraud hadn't been limited to stealing from his mother. It had been part of a systematic criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple lives. At 6 a.m, my phone rang. Michael's number appeared on the caller ID, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was barely recognizable. Gone was the calculated manipulation of our previous conversation. In its place was raw panic and desperation. "What did you do?" he whispered, and I could hear genuine terror in his voice. "I protected myself. All the accounts are frozen. Everything I've been working toward, everything I've saved, it's all gone." "You mean everything you stole is gone?" "Everything you built with my identity has been reclaimed by its rightful owner." "Mom, you don't understand. These people, they're going to think I cooperated with law enforcement. They're going to think I gave up information to get back at them." "Did you?" "No, but that won't matter. They'll kill me just for the possibility that I might have talked." I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected, a complete absence of sympathy. The fear in Michael's voice was genuine, but it was fear of consequences he'd created through his own choices. For the first time in his life, he was facing a situation that couldn't be solved by manipulation, lies, or having someone else absorb the damage he'd caused. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you became a criminal. I'm your son. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA. The son I raised died the first time he stole my identity. The person I'm talking to now is someone I don't know and don't trust. Please, Mom. I'm begging you. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I don't deserve to die for them. What about the other victims, Michael? What about the other families you've helped destroy? Did they deserve what you did to them? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. In all his panic about his own situation, he hadn't spared a thought for the people he'd victimized. Even facing death, he was incapable of seeing beyond his own needs and fears. I can make this right, he said finally. I can give the authorities information about the people I was working with. I can help them shut down the whole operation. In exchange for what? Protection, witness protection, reduced charges, a chance to start over. And what about the victims? What about the money you've stolen, the lives you've destroyed? What about accountability for the crimes you've committed? I can't undo what's already been done, but I can prevent it from happening to other people. For the first time since he'd abandoned me at that bus stop, Michael was talking about something other than his own immediate needs. It wasn't genuine remorse. I knew him well enough to recognize calculated self-interest when I heard it, but it was at least an acknowledgement that his actions had affected other people. The authorities already have everything they need to shut down the operation, I told him. What do you mean? I mean, I spent the night documenting every transaction, every account, every connection I could find in your digital footprints. I've provided law enforcement with a complete map of the criminal network you've been part of. You did what? I did what you should have done months ago. I chose the victims over the criminals. I could hear Michael breathing heavily, processing the implications of what I'd told him. His value as an informant was gone. His knowledge of the criminal operation was no longer unique or necessary. He had nothing left to bargain with except his own guilt. So what happens now? Now you face the consequences of your choices. All of them. The identity theft, the fraud, the criminal, conspiracy, the threats against me. You face them honestly, without lies or manipulation or attempts to shift blame to someone else. And if I do that, if I confess to everything and accept responsibility, then maybe you'll finally become the person I tried to raise you to. I'm not. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was the closest thing to hope I could offer someone who'd systematically destroyed everything good between us. I'm scared, Mom. You should be. Fear is appropriate when you've done what you've done. Will you come to my hearing? When I turn myself in? The question surprised me. After everything he'd put me through, everything he'd stolen from me, all the lies and betrayals and threats, he still wanted me there. Still needed the comfort of my presence during his moment of reckoning. Why would you want me there? Because despite everything that's happened, despite all the terrible things I've done, you're still my mother, and I'm still the little boy who used to be afraid of thunderstorms. The reference to his childhood hit me harder than I'd expected. I remembered those nights when he'd crawl into my bed during storms, how small and vulnerable he'd seemed, how completely he'd trusted me to keep him safe from things that frightened him. But I also remembered the woman who'd sat at a bus stop after surgery, abandoned and betrayed by the person she'd loved most in the world. I remembered discovering the extent of his theft, the systematic destruction of my financial security, the threats he'd made when cornered with his crimes. That little boy grew up to become someone who would threaten his own mother to avoid consequences. That little boy became someone who would steal from the person who sacrificed everything for him. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than I've ever been about anything in my life. Sorry doesn't fix destroyed credit scores, Michael. Sorry doesn't recover stolen money or restore broken trust. Sorry is just a word you use when you want something from someone. Then what would fix it? What would make this right? Nothing. Some things can't be fixed or made right. Some relationships can't be repaired once they've been broken in certain ways. So that's it? We're done? You'll never forgive me? I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was complicated, layered with emotions and history and competing definitions of what it meant to let go of anger and hurt. I may eventually forgive you for the pain you've caused me, I said finally. But I'll never again trust you. With access to my life, my resources, or my vulnerability, the relationship we had is over, Michael. It died the first time you used my love for you as a weapon against me. What if I could prove I've changed? What if I could show you that I've learned from this and become someone different? Then you'd be doing it for yourself, not for me. Because I'm done investing in your potential for growth. I'm done sacrificing my well-being for your benefit. I'm done being your safety net, your backup plan, your source of unconditional rescue. The conversation ended there. Not with dramatic declarations or emotional breakdowns, but with the quiet recognition that some chapters of life reach natural conclusions. The story of Rebecca and Michael, mother and son, benefactor and beneficiary, enabler and enabled, was over. 3 days later, Michael turned himself in to federal authorities. The charges against him were extensive: identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and a dozen other crimes related to his participation in the organized fraud ring. His cooperation with the investigation was minimal, most of. The information he could have provided had already been gathered through the digital evidence I'd compiled. The trial proceeded swiftly. Michael pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior after 6 years. The judge noted that his crimes had affected dozens of victims and caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial damage. I attended the sentencing hearing, not to support Michael, but to speak as a victim. My victim impact statement was brief and factual. I described the financial damage his theft had caused, the emotional trauma of discovering his betrayal, the ongoing challenges of rebuilding my credit and my sense of security. I didn't mention love or disappointment or broken maternal bonds. I spoke about financial statements and credit scores and the practical realities of identity theft recovery. I spoke as Rebecca Jenkins, crime victim, not as Michael's mother. When the judge asked if I had anything else to add, I looked directly at Michael for the first time since he'd left my house months earlier. Your Honor, the defendant has spent his entire adult life avoiding consequences for his choices. He's learned to manipulate the people who love him into absorbing the damage his decisions cause. Today's sentence may be the first real consequence he's ever faced, and I hope it teaches him what 35 years of motherhood couldn't: that actions have results, and love doesn't mean shielding people from the outcomes of their behavior. Michael's eyes filled with tears as I spoke, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sadness, no anger. Just the completion of a long, difficult process that had transformed both of us into different people than we'd been when it started. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunlight and drove home to the life I'd built during my transformation from victim to survivor. My garden was thriving, full of vegetables I'd learned to grow and flowers I'd chosen for my own pleasure rather than someone else's needs. Mrs. Chen was waiting on her porch when I arrived, as she often did when she knew I'd had a difficult day. We sat together in comfortable silence, two elderly women who'd learned to find peace in simple pleasures and mutual support. "How do you feel?" she asked eventually. "Free," I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in 35 years, I wasn't responsible for managing someone else's crises. I wasn't monitoring someone else's choices or preparing to absorb someone else's consequences. I wasn't defined by my relationship to a person who saw me primarily as a resource to be exploited. I was simply Rebecca Jenkins, a woman who'd learned to value herself enough to demand that others value her too. A woman who'd discovered that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling. A woman who'd found strength she never knew she possessed by finally setting limits on what she was willing to sacrifice for someone else's benefit. The financial recovery took longer than I'd hoped, but less time than I'd feared. Working with fraud specialists and victim advocates, I was able to restore most of my credit and recover a significant portion of the money Michael had stolen. The process was complicated and time-consuming, but it was also empowering in ways I hadn't expected. Learning to advocate for myself, to navigate complex financial systems, to demand accountability from institutions that initially tried to dismiss my claims. All of it contributed to my sense of personal agency and competence. I discovered skills and strengths I'd never needed when someone else was constantly creating crises that required all my emotional and financial resources. 2 years after Michael's sentencing, I received a letter from him in prison. He wrote about the classes he was taking, the counseling he was receiving, the insights he'd gained about his behavior and its impact on others. He asked about my health, my activities, my happiness. He expressed remorse for his crimes and gratitude for the lessons his consequences had taught him. He didn't ask me to visit. He didn't request money or support or forgiveness. He simply wanted me to know that he was using his time in prison to become someone different, someone who might eventually be worthy of the mother who'd raised him. I wrote back once, briefly. I told him I was glad he was making positive changes and hoped he would continue growing during his incarceration. I wished him well in his efforts to build a better life after his release. I signed the letter Rebecca Jenkins rather than Mom. It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. The woman who'd been his mother was gone, replaced by someone who valued herself too much to resume a relationship built on exploitation and manipulation. Rebecca Jenkins might wish Michael well, but she wouldn't again make herself vulnerable to his dysfunction. The months passed peacefully. I traveled for the first time in decades, visiting my sister in Atlanta and taking a cruise to Alaska. I'd always dreamed about, but never prioritized when Michael's needs dominated my budget. I dated occasionally, something that had been impossible, when all my emotional energy was devoted to managing his crises. I made real friends, people who knew me as an individual, rather than as someone's perpetually sacrificing mother. I pursued interests and hobbies I'd abandoned years earlier. I invested in my own future rather than constantly bailing someone else out of the consequences of poor choices. Most importantly, I learned to recognize the difference between helping and enabling, between love and codependency, between supporting someone's growth and absorbing their damage. The boundaries I'd finally learned to set weren't walls designed to keep people out. They were foundations that made healthy relationships possible. 6 months before Michael's scheduled release, he wrote to me again. This letter was different from the first. Instead of reporting on his progress or expressing general remorse, he made a specific request. He wanted to meet with me after his release, not to resume our previous relationship, but to apologize properly and make whatever amends might be possible. He acknowledged that he had no right to expect my agreement to such a meeting. He understood that I'd built a life that didn't include him and had no obligation to make space for him in it, but he hoped that someday, when he demonstrated sustained change over a period of years, we might find a way to have some kind of relationship that didn't require me to sacrifice my well-being for his benefit. I considered the request for weeks before responding. The woman I'd become was capable of protecting herself from manipulation and exploitation. She could meet with Michael without being drawn back into patterns of enabling and rescue. She could listen to his apologies and make her own decisions about what, if anything, she was willing to offer going forward. But she could also choose not to. She could decide that some chapters of life are meant to stay closed, that some relationships have served their purpose and reached their natural end. She could prioritize her own peace and security over someone else's need for closure and redemption. In the end, I wrote back with a simple message. We'll see. It wasn't a yes or a no. It wasn't hope or rejection. It was an acknowledgement that the future was open, that decisions about relationships could be made based on evidence rather than obligation, that love didn't require sacrifice of self-respect or personal boundaries. 3 weeks before Michael's release, I received an unexpected phone call from a victim advocate working with other people who'd been affected by the identity theft ring Michael had participated in. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking at a conference about financial fraud, sharing my story of recovery and empowerment with other victims who were struggling to rebuild their lives. The invitation excited me in ways I hadn't anticipated. For so many years, my story had been defined by other people's needs and crises. The idea of using my experience to help others navigate similar challenges felt like a completion of my transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. I accepted the speaking engagement and spent weeks preparing my presentation. I focused on practical strategies for fraud recovery, emotional techniques for rebuilding trust and confidence, and the importance of setting boundaries that protect victims from further exploitation. But I also talked about something else: the unexpected gifts that can emerge from devastating betrayals, the strength you discover when you're forced to advocate for yourself, the clarity that comes when you stop enabling someone else's dysfunction, the peace that follows when you learn to value yourself enough to demand that others value you too. The morning of the conference, I stood in front of a mirror in my hotel room and saw someone I barely recognized. Gone was the anxious, depleted woman who'd existed primarily to serve someone else's needs. In her place was someone confident, purposeful, and genuinely content with the life she'd built. Rebecca Jenkins, crime victim, had become Rebecca Jenkins, survivor and advocate. The transformation was complete. As I walked toward the conference room, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The abandonment at the bus stop that had initiated my awakening. The discovery of years of betrayal that had shattered my illusions. The choice to prosecute rather than enable that had marked my commitment to truth over comfort. Each painful step had been necessary to become the person I was today. Each loss had made space for something better. Each boundary I'd learned to set had protected something valuable within myself. The conference presentation went better than I'd hoped. The audience of fraud victims and advocates responded to my story with recognition and appreciation. During the question and answer session, person after person shared their own experiences of betrayal by trusted family members, their struggles with guilt and obligation, their difficulty in setting boundaries with people they loved. I realized that my story wasn't unique. Across the country, parents were being exploited by adult children who'd learned to weaponize family loyalty against personal responsibility. Spouses were absorbing consequences for partners who refused to grow up. Siblings were sacrificing their futures to enable brothers and sisters who saw love as an unlimited credit line. The common thread wasn't the specific crimes or betrayals. It was the difficulty of separating love from enabling, the challenge of helping without harming, the courage required to let someone you care about face the consequences of their own choices. After the conference, I drove home through familiar neighborhoods that looked different now that I saw them through the eyes of someone who valued herself. The house that had once been a refuge for someone else's crises was now simply my home, a place where I made decisions based on my own needs and preferences. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set, surrounded by plants I'd chosen and nurtured for my own pleasure. The daffodils that had marked my first spring of independence were gone now, replaced by a more mature landscape that reflected years of careful tending and patient growth. My phone rang as darkness fell. The caller ID showed Michael's name, but when I answered, it wasn't his voice on the line. Ms. Jenkins? This is Officer Patricia Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'm calling about your son, Michael Jenkins. My heart stopped. What's happened? He was attacked by another inmate 3 days ago. He's in the hospital, but he's stable. He asked me to call you. Is he going to be okay? The doctors think so. But Ms. Jenkins, he wanted me to tell you something specific. What? He said to tell you that he understands now why you couldn't save him from this. He said he's grateful that you taught him to face consequences instead of running from them. He said he's finally learning what responsibility means. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, thinking about the little boy who'd been afraid of thunderstorms and the man who'd learned to create his own storms through his choices. I thought about the mother who'd tried to shield him from every difficulty and the woman who'd finally learned that some lessons can only be taught through experience. I felt sadness for his pain, hope for his growth, and gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and strength. But I didn't feel responsible for fixing his situation or absorbing his consequences. I felt like someone who cared about his well-being without sacrificing her own. The next morning, I called the hospital where Michael was recovering. I spoke briefly with his doctor, confirmed that he was indeed stable and healing, and left a simple message for him. I'm glad you're okay. Keep learning. It wasn't everything he might have wanted from me, but it was everything I was willing to give. And for the first time in 35 years, that felt like exactly enough. Some storms, I'd finally learned, are meant to be weathered alone. Some lessons are too important to be cushioned by someone else's sacrifice. And some love is best expressed by stepping back and allowing people to become who they're meant to be, even when that process is difficult to watch. Rebecca Jenkins had learned to love without losing herself, and that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.